Are you a fan of true crime? Novels, movies, whatever? Are you a huge fan of psychological thrillers? Do you ever wonder what the likelihood is that people could get away with a crime by claiming that they are insane? If that interests you, you are going to love this podcast on the insanity defense. I'm Mr. E. This is MysterE's, and I'm here today to talk to you about the insanity defense. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to give you a little bit of background behind where the insanity defense comes from. I'm not going to get too much into crazy details. There's a whole lot to it. But I love to keep my podcast at anywhere between 9 and 12 minutes because I want you to be able to listen to this on your commutes. So we're going to keep it in that window here. So very brief history. We're going to start off back in 1843 with Daniel Macnaghten and something that turned into the Macnaghten Rule. Back in 1843, there was a treatise about the insanity defense. This guy named Daniel Macnaghten was experiencing these paranoid delusions, and he wanted to kill a famous. This was in England. He wanted to kill a duke, and he ended up not killing a member of the royal family, but he ended up killing the person's secretary. And so he went to trial, and his lawyer had just read this treatise, and he claimed that Danny Macnaghten was not guilty by reason of insanity. It took, and he ended up being sentenced in a mental facility. So that was like the first time. I mean, ancient Greek and Rome, they dealt with it too, but I'm not going to go that into detail with you. So I'm going to jump to 1954 and this thing called the Durham Rule. And the Durham Rule is really all about broadening the insanity defense and looking at mental disease and defect as being a reason for the committing of a crime. And so that hit in early 1950s. Well, it gave a little bit of a looser description of what insanity was. And so there was a few more cases where people were found not guilty by reason of insanity. Ultimately, it led to March 30th, 1981. And on March 30th, 1981, Ronald Reagan was our president, and he was getting ready to walk into his limo when a guy by the name of John Hinckley Jr. Shot him along with 4 other people. As you know, Reagan survived, but Hinckley ended up going to trial. In the trial, his defense pleaded the insanity defense, and ultimately, he was proven not guilty by reason of insanity. And he was sentenced to a maximum security health facility where he was up until just a few years ago, where he had slowly been released on his own recognizance here and there, and now he's out. But at the time in the early 1980s, the public was furious. Here we have one of our leaders, one that everybody loved, unlike today's current climate. Majority of the population loved Ronald Reagan at this time. And we have a guy that committed this horrific crime, wounding 5 people and getting away with it, right? So at that point, moving forward, there was this thing called the Comprehensive Crime Control Act. And what it did is it laid out a much stronger foundation of what we needed to have for the insanity defense. And this is where we get into the nuts and bolts. So now, since that act, since the early 1980s, the insanity defense has become much more strict. So if you don't know this, the insanity defense is actually just a legal term. It has nothing to do with, you're not going to find it in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual on Mental Illnesses. It is not a psychological term. It is a legal term. So that's the first thing that we need to find out. And for a client to be found not guilty by reason of insanity, you have to be able to look at something called intent. Ultimately, what this comes down to is you have to prove that your client, the defendant, that they, number one, at the time of the crime, they did not know what they were doing was wrong. And number two, it could not be premeditated. So that was the groundwork of having to prove a lack of intent for the insanity defense. So it became very, very difficult from the early 1980s up until today to prove that your client was not guilty by reason of insanity. There's a few other things that come into play with this. Number one, when you walk into a courtroom and you're the defendant, you have all heard this before. You are innocent until proven guilty, right? So what happens is the burden of proof lies with the prosecution, and the prosecution has to prove beyond a doubt that you intended to kill the person and the person is thus dead, or you intended to do the crime and the crime was committed. Okay. So the burden of proof lies with the prosecution. But as soon as you shift to a not guilty by reason of insanity, the burden of proof lies with the defense. What's interesting about that is that now the defense is pretty much admitting that their client committed the crime. But now what they have to prove beyond a doubt is that their client, number one, didn't know what they were doing at the time was wrong, so they lacked intent, and it was not premeditated. This is going to be very, very difficult to prove. Now, the insanity defense comes down to individual states. So the states within the U.S., they get to kind of determine what their insanity defense is. And after the whole Hinckley case with John F. Kennedy, with a different one, a different outcome, with the Ronald Reagan situation, what we had is people were furious. So we actually had 3 states get rid of the insanity defense altogether. And that was Utah, Montana, and Idaho. They got rid of it. You could not claim not guilty by reason of insanity. Now, other states, guilty but mental defect, guilty but mentally ill at the time, different types of defenses, right? So, but it was super tight and very difficult to be found not guilty by reason of insanity. So you might ask, well, how difficult? So I looked up this information, and I've known this for a few years, and it stayed pretty much consistent over the last 10, 15 years of researching this. But in all felony cases in the United States, the defense uses the insanity defense 1% of the time. And of that 1% of the time that the insanity defense is used, if it is a violent crime, it is successful about 1% of the time, which is equivalent to 1 in 10,000 felonious cases of violence where a person is found not guilty by reason of insanity. Now, in other cases where people are found not guilty by reason of insanity, that still use 1% of the time, and it's successful less than 30% of the time. But for violent crimes, it's almost impossible to prove. So when we look at this and we look at the insanity defense, we have a lot of movies, media, that sort of stuff that makes us think that it's really common and everybody's getting away with it. But it's actually incredibly uncommon. It's very, very rare that people are found not guilty by reason of insanity. And so it's not really common, but we have a tendency to think that it is. But it's pretty rare, actually. And just to give you an idea, I'm going to be going over with you in future podcasts. I'm going to be going over 4 or 5 different cases. And I just want to give you just a very brief idea. of how difficult it is. So if somebody is a paranoid schizophrenic and they're hearing voices screaming at them to kill, 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 right? And you may say, oh my God, they're mentally ill, whatever, but this is the deal. They pick up the phone, they call 911, and they say something like this. Yeah, I had voices in my head that were telling me to kill, and so I killed. I knew it was wrong, but I had to do it. Otherwise, people were going to go to hell. Because that person said that they knew what they were doing was wrong, that person is going to be guilty. You cannot use the insanity defense. So it is incredibly rare. It's incredibly difficult. And we're going to touch on some of those subjects on the future. We're also going to talk about this concept called competency, which we will get to a future podcast as well. So I want to thank you for joining us today. I also want to give a shout out to our executive producer and director, Bear Wade, with Unify Creative Agency. If you are doing a startup company, if you have another business, if you are an influencer and you need some marketing done, Bear Wade is your man. Make sure you subscribe to our future podcast so you can get all the updated information. Check us out on TikTok, on YouTube, on Instagram, on Facebook. We are there and we're waiting for you to follow us. I hope you have a terrific day. Take care. We'll see you. Bye-bye.